Hello, good morning, good afternoon to you wherever you are, and welcome once again to the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Jim, I see you are there. How are you doing, Jim? I think your microphone is still off.
Sorry, you think I'd know by now.
Well, but
good, Ernest. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine, yeah. And glad to see you again. But before I hand over to you, I would like to say a big thank you to the participants, the government of Benin, to sponsors, to speakers, and everyone who made the 18th edition of the African Cashew Alliance annual Cashew Conference and Expo a success. It was a pleasure having you all, and thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you in Tanzania next year. Tanzania is normally in November, so next year, November, Tanzania, we move. So, hey, Jim, I know you will be having a guest today, but I want to hand over to you so that you address the key questions that have arisen since the 1 month that we have been away from the Global Markets Encounter. So, Jim, over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Ernest.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. I'd just like to add my appreciation to the ACA team for the conference in Cotonou a couple of weeks ago.
Thank you so much, Jim. Thanks so much.
Great event, and I'm really looking forward to the next one in Tanzania. So let's talk about cashews this morning, and we're going to focus on, let's say, what happens in the last quarter of the year. So we're going to do that by looking at some questions, and there are 4 questions I've posed for this morning's discussion. Firstly, what is the market situation right now? It's been a month since we talked on this event. Few things have changed, and we're coming into a very interesting time of year. It is a time of year when we get a lot of rumors, we get a lot of policy changes and considerations on policy, particularly for the upcoming season in West Africa. Discussions about the weather, flowering, all of these factors that would influence how this market behaves next year. So it's important to understand what usually we would expect at this time of year and where we are now. So thus the question, what is the market situation now? Second question is, can this remarkable, and it is remarkable, demand trend continue? Are there enough cashews in the world to meet demand in 2024? If you look at some of the social media chatter, you'll see a lot of alarms, a lot of people talking it up, a lot of people talking about crisis and so on. I don't agree with that, and I'm going to tell you why a little bit later on. And then we're going to finish with our guest, and we're going to look at, really in the news at this time of year, what's the situation in Tanzania. So I'll briefly introduce our guest now, and we'll come back to him a little bit later. He is James Mulhall, the Managing Director of Coastal Nuts in Tanzania. Coastal Nuts is a relatively new processor, going a couple of years, modern process. You can see James and his colleagues in the video showing the Minister of Agriculture of Tanzania around the factory. We're going to talk to James later. We're going to have a chat about the situation in Tanzania. But for now, let's get back to our first question. What is the market situation right now? And as always, we're thinking globally. So let's start and look at what we would normally expect October to December. What is demand and consumption during that period? Well, it is a period of festivals. September through to January, we see a lot of festivals. Diwali in India, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and it finishes off with Tet and Chinese New Year. So it is the peak consumption period in many major cashew markets. But markets have different characteristics, and people talking about expectations of additional demand to meet the festivals or to meet the winter demand, as it's been termed, maybe a little bit off the mark. If we look in Europe, Europe is 18% of world demand. It's an important market. But European buyers buy forward and imports peak mid-year. They actually fall away a little bit over recent years in the last quarter. If we look in the US market, something similar. Again, US buyers buy forward, imports peak in the middle of the year, and the last quarter tends to be the lows for the year. So what the buying is done in these forward buying markets, the buying is done quite early, up to a year before the event, in fact, and imports peak mid-year. So they peak mid-year in order to meet that demand spike toward the end of the year. If we look in China, a little bit of a different situation. Well, first of all, the peak is a little bit later because Chinese New Year this year is the 29th of January, I believe. Very little forward buying in China. So imports tend to peak toward the end of the year. And of course, because the Chinese market is so close to Vietnam, imports and shipments pretty much mean the same thing, whereas in Europe and in the USA, shipments might take place up to 2 months before the actual import. So we need to bear that in mind, and we need therefore to bear in mind that if we're waiting for demand spikes for Thanksgiving in the US or for Christmas in Europe or North America, they're not going to come. That deal is already done. So let's try and make some sense of it then. Let's try and put demand in context. And we look at some of the major markets. I will come to India. India is the world's biggest market, and it's a highly seasonal market in terms of its demand, and the major demand period is round about now, coming up to Diwali. But the raw cashew nuts, and of course, in the international market, Indian demand is expressed in imports of raw cashew nuts. The raw cashew nuts for this were bought and imported months ago. They may well still be traded from warehouse to processor in India, but the actual import took place some time ago, and the purchase obviously before that. If we look in Europe, we're seeing a relatively quiet spot market, strong demand, but a relatively quiet spot market, buying done well in advance. Economies in Europe are mixed. Some are very strong, some are not so strong, but generally we are seeing resilience in consumption and improving economic conditions. United States, huge market, again, seasonal market, peak demand around what we might call the winter festivals, Thanksgiving, the last Thursday in November, Christmas toward the end of December, New Year festival, the very end of December. And the US also has a slightly longer period because they have a huge sports event, end of January, early February, with American football. Economy is strong. Consumers appear to be concerned, particularly about higher food prices, and they've been seeing that for some time. We've all been seeing it for some time, but it is a key concern in the United States. But imports are strong. No, they're not. They're very strong. Again, buying done in advance, forward buying, key factors in both of these markets. In China, peak demand later in the year, as we've mentioned, when Chinese imports come, and we have seen a surge in demand from China in 2024. So we would expect that China will account for 12% of world consumption of cashews in 2024. That's heading up toward US levels. This is quite remarkable. And whether or not that will continue is a subject we'll come to a little bit later. So when we look at this, and we look at this pattern of demand, we think most of the raw material buying is done, certainly for all of the Western festival seasons. Most of it's done for Diwali in India, quite obviously, and a good portion is done for China, but there can be more to follow. If we think about what will the impact of demand over the next 2 months during that festival period be, well, what it will do is it will determine the next steps for buyers. Will they buy? Will they wait? How much will they buy? How much of the product they need will they buy forward? How much will they carry in inventory? For example, will Indian processors restock raw cashew nuts after Diwali? And of course, it'll determine the price they're prepared to pay. So what happens now has a long-term influence on what will happen in the new crops from the end of January forward. Let's have a look at production in this period. Well, I think everyone knows that this is the lower period for production. On current calculations in 2023, only about 15% of the world's cashews were harvested in the last quarter of the year. So we have lower production period. Let's have a look at that in context. Again, so we're looking at Southern Hemisphere production. Brazil around about 3%, East Africa around 8%, and Indonesia around 2%. This year, the initial forecast, the official Brazilian forecast, is well up on last year, 151,000 tons. That's a 29% increase on last year's crop. A note of caution is that at this time last year, the forecast also was quite optimistic, but the crop was much smaller than that. But as we know, and this is their August estimate, 151,000 tons, that would be a good crop in Brazil by modern standards. Indonesia, the crop has been coming in well. Indonesia can produce up to 160,000 tons. Domestic consumption is a huge factor, of course. There are some concerns about one area, that's Flores, one of the producing islands, but I don't think overall it's going to make a huge dent, but it will certainly mean the crop is a little bit smaller than expected, and that some of the higher quality material, because those islands are well known for their high quality nuts, some of the higher quality material won't be available. It's higher quality compared to the nuts that grow in Sulawesi. So a little question mark there, but probably not too great a question mark. Tanzania, I'm going to talk about it later. The Cashew Board of Tanzania is projecting an excellent crop. Last year, they tell us the crop was 310,000 tons. We're going to talk to James Mulhall. We're going to have a look at some of the figures a little bit later on in this session. And Mozambique, a little bit early, but so far optimistic forecasts. Weather looks okay. We could be looking at another quite good crop in Mozambique. Overall, I think that Southern Hemisphere crops could be up by about 160,000 tons. That's an improved outturn for Southern Hemisphere crops, around about 25% up. But let's be clear, that doesn't change hugely the overall crop prospects. It represents about 4% of the world crop. Significant, very significant in this period, October through to December, but less significant in the big picture going into next year. We'll have a look at prices and we'll try and put some context on prices. So as everyone's aware, we're looking at WW320s. We're looking at the lowest price origin, which is almost always Vietnam. And we're looking at a kind of a mid-price between the low and the high quality processors, which is the way I do it to try and give us a reasonable, fair guideline to the market. Prices at the moment on that basis, in a fairly wide range, I'd have to say, but it looks like about $3.30, $3.32 would be a mid-price. There are some cheaper sellers and there are, of course, top processors offering forward at much higher prices, all the way up to $3.50. African processors, we should note, still, particularly West African processors on location, East African processors on quality and proximity to certain markets are making prices at least 20 cents a pound premium to the general price mentioned in Vietnam. That looks here to stay. It's been with us since about April 2022. It looks like a permanent fixture for obvious reasons. We've talked about those on this event before. So what we're looking at is prices which are well above both the 2-year and the 5-year averages. But let's look back a little bit. Let's look back pre this collapse from mid-2022. And we're in a price range that was quite sustainable through 2019, pre-COVID, during COVID, and in the the period just after the initial COVID crisis. So we're not in any way, despite the sharp increase in prices, we're not in any way in unprecedented price range. We're not in any way in a price range that might not have been expected. As I've said many times, and I'll say it again, it is not so much that this range of prices we're currently in is unusual. What was unusual is that we sustained such low prices for such a long period of time. So we are looking at a sharp increase in price. I think it's about 36% increase in price from the bottom to the top this year. That means that in markets that trade for prompt, so in markets where buyers buy for next week, next month, those prices are immediately reflected back onto demand, and they've got to manage that. So we're talking here about markets in India, the domestic market for kernels in India. We're talking about China, and we're talking about markets in the Middle East. So these markets where trade is between spot and 3 months forward are all seeing the direct impact of these higher prices on consumer demand. In Western markets, where forward contracts are a major factor, most contracts that are open were made in this price range. So we're going back to first, second quarter of last year, and there will still be some contracts outstanding from that period through to first quarter into the early second quarter of this year. So in this period, there's a lot of forward contracts were made. Many of them were shipped. Some of them are delayed and defaulted. So in those markets that buy forward, and those are often the same markets where they have what they call modern retail. Not keen on the name myself, but what it means is where we have distribution through supermarkets. So we're talking about markets like Japan, South Korea, Australia, Europe, parts of the Middle East, and North America. These markets often have forward contracts, and therefore they've got to deal with defaults of contract. Now, what's interesting, I think, in this scenario is that there's a good chance in many markets that lower prices were not passed on to the consumer. So this may apply in the US, for example. It may apply in some markets in Europe. So that the consumer prices might be still based on these levels, around about $3 a pound. So the increase at consumer level that one would expect may not be seen to the same extent. In fact, it may not be seen at all. What's in the market is in the market, and we may already see that the retail prices are well able to cope with the current levels, maybe some moderate increases, but that remains to be seen. What is for sure is that the impact of delays and defaults is huge in terms of customer confidence and buyers' reaction to the current market situation. RCN prices, well, again, we've seen this remarkable increase in RCN prices. If you pick the bottom of the market around the end of February, you were looking at a 59% increase. Now that is obviously reflected on also a little bit of what quality was available in February and what quality is available now, and that has an impact on it. But we do an index, as you may know if you've been with us previously, and that's the dotted red line. And you can see that that now is at levels that we haven't seen since 2019. And you really have to wonder whether these RCN prices are workable. So we're at prices now that we haven't seen since 2020, January. At that time, 320s were $3.20 a pound. That's just pre-COVID. And actually at that time, 320s were looking like they might start to move up. 320s were 320, raw cashew nuts were up at these levels, and the price as a new crop came in 2020 and COVID hit, prices dropped by about $350 a ton. If we go back for the previous time when raw cashew nut prices were at current levels, you got to go back to May 2018. And in May 2018, 320s were $4.15 a pound FOB in Vietnam. So we really have to look at this relationship between raw cashew nut prices and kernels prices in the current market. And if we look at simply taking our index, so the index is calculated through a basket of the available raw cashew nuts. It doesn't take into account the different quality, it just takes into account price and availability. So, but if we take it and if we work it off a 48 pounds average quality available today, my calculations, the cost price of 320s, export 320s is around $3.27 for most processors in the export market. Now, if you are a processor looking to sell in a market that's 332, even 340, that's not going to make money. Certainly not going to make enough money to justify paying these raw cashew nut prices. And I think maybe this is where we're looking at a mismatch at the moment. Not for the first time this year, but more of a mismatch now than we've seen earlier in the year. So that's a big question mark as we go forward. So looking at the market situation now, we look at demand, we look at production, we look at pricing. On demand, it looks to me that Western demand is strong based on lower import prices and increasing consumer demand. In markets where we have much more prompt and spot trading, demand is definitely challenged by higher kernels prices. I think that's seen in India. I think it's seen to a certain extent in the Middle East. And there is a question mark about China right now, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a while. If we look at production, definitely better crops in the Southern Hemisphere. 25% increase is great news for farmers, processors, traders in the Southern Hemisphere, but it only adds about 4% to the world crop overall. So good news, but not as impactful as a figure like 25% might initially sound. Pricing, I think kernels prices around these levels are sustainable, certainly in this range are sustainable. History supports that, demand supports that, and the current activity of many buyers supports that. But raw cashew nut prices, on the basis of the calculation, appear too high. They're too high versus kernels, and they're too high versus price history over the last 5 or so years. So an interesting situation, conflicting trends, RCN going one way, kernels going another. Generally a very positive year for cashews despite poor crops in certain countries. So our second question, can the strong demand trend continue? And this is probably the biggest question because it has been a remarkable year for demand. We'll start by having a look at the Vietnamese situation. Now, Vietnam is the bellwether, the benchmark for the cashew industry worldwide with a huge market share in all of the major markets today, with the exception of India, of course. So if we look at Vietnam's cashew kernels monthly exports, percentage change, so this is July 2024 compared to July 2023. So as you can see, I'm going to ignore the first 2 months because this was due to timing. This was due to when Tet occurred, Chinese New Year, slight distortion. Let's have a look from March onwards. So we saw very strong improvement almost all the way through until July. Now bear in mind, July shipments would be really the last realistic period for Western demand for the festival seasons. July, perhaps early August. As we go into August, and now in the first half of September, for the first time realistically this year, we're seeing that shipments are lower than last year. And we haven't seen that any time this year. We haven't seen it even close for most of the year. Is that a signal? Let's have a look. So if we look at Vietnamese exports, so now we've got January to August exports. So what I've done is I use the Vietnam's Customs Service figures, and I've taken the first 8 months of each year, and that's what it looks like. Obviously 2024 is way ahead. So what we've seen over this period, 2017 to 2019, is 10% growth through to 2020, in fact. that was pretty much sustained despite the disappointing 2022. The second half of 2022 was a real slowdown, but overall the trend maintained around 9%. And then this year we get this huge jump, plus 21% so far, January to August. What happened? How did it happen? And what's likely to happen next? So first of all, let's go back 2017, 2018, just to get a clue and think about what happens when you get price volatility. So 2017 was some of the highest prices we have ever seen for cashew kernels. Market crashed in the second half of 2018, but definitely growth slowed based on this kind of price volatility. There was virtually no growth between 2017 and 2018. Over the ensuing years, 2020 to 2021, the market returned to its positive growth trend. And despite COVID, in fact, supported by COVID in 2021, we saw fast growth. Second half of 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine in the February. Big economic impact of that. Inflation in Europe, inflation in the United States, inflation virtually throughout the world. And we saw this slump in demand. So one of the few years when demand for cashews actually fell. That's a very rare occurrence. That kicked off the fears that led to the price decrease. So 2022, second half of the year, prices went down, dropped off by about 20%, about 60 cents a pound. They dropped off at that period, well, roughly by as much as they've just gone up this year, which is an interesting thought. And the market stayed down over a longer period. That led, in turn, to very strong demand growth. So demand returned to strong growth for various reasons: economic improvement, low prices, depending on the market you look at. And then this year, in the second quarter, we get this, and I'm still calling it a perceived shortage because I'm not sure, and we look again at production, but I'm not sure that really we're going to have a shortage this year. But if we look at the reaction, we get this huge price increase. Market shoots up way too high and then corrects. So this was a reaction to the perception of a shortage. Well, actually, it was a reaction to a smaller crop in West Africa. But that's not necessarily a shortage, depending on how small that crop might have been. What's driving this trend? Let's have a look at the markets that are driving Vietnam's cashew kernels exports. So if we look, I look at the markets like this. I look at East Asia, excluding China, because I look at China separately. West Asia, which is what some people might call the Middle East, the top 9 countries in Europe, and North America, Canada, and the United States primarily. If we look at these markets, we see 7% growth in East Asia. That's pretty much on the long-term trend. In West Asia, we see strong growth. So 18%. Now that is definitely a reaction to lower prices. We're seeing very strong growth in that market. Europe, top 9 countries. Now we're talking here about shipments. So these are shipments from Vietnam up to the end of August. So shipments to the top 9 countries in Europe are up by 16%. But imports into the European Union as a whole are only up by 8% up to the end of July, which is the latest figures available. So there is something of a disparity there, and this may be a signal that this shipment figure could cool down, could drop away in the last quarter. So when I look at those two figures, I don't think that imports are going to finish up 16% in Europe in 2024. And therefore, shipments from Vietnam cannot be up by that amount as well, particularly when you take into account that in the first 7 months of the year, African exporters of cashew kernels had a 21% market share in the European Union. So there's a signal there of a slowdown in my mind. North America, Shipments from Vietnam up to the end of August, up 27%. That's really remarkable. Imports up by 20%. So maybe there will be something of a slowdown for similar reasons in the United States, but it does look very impressive. And we know the US is a price sensitive market, so we really need to consider what are the impacts of these much higher prices. We look at China. Well, it is amazing. Shipments from Vietnam are up 42%. So China appears to have finally discovered cashew nuts in 2023 and in 2024. This big question is, how long will this last? Is this actually what we've been waiting for many years, which is China and cashews fall in love and the whole supply demand calculation changes? So what we're seeing is that Vietnam's exports are driven by China and North America. And these are both highly price sensitive markets. Excuse me for a moment, if I just talk to our team, the French interpretation is coming through on the English channel at the moment. If you just have a look at that, please. So going back to what markets are driving Vietnam's cashew kernels exports, we're talking about exports driven by two highly price sensitive markets. Now, Europe is a little less price sensitive. Now, people who sell cashews to European buyers won't agree with me, but it is. And Europe is buying more in African countries. So it might be a little bit more sustainable, a little bit less sensitive to these price rises. But definitely there are signals of a little bit of a slowdown in Europe, and we should expect that prices will influence demand in China and the United States during 2025. In India, so India is probably the most difficult market to understand, but definitely the world's largest market. So I'm going to stick with RCN imports for the moment. India's imports of RCN tend to peak mid-year. This year, the latest official figures, end of July, imports are down by 11%. That's the lowest since 2021 for that period. Listening to commentators in India, it looks like demand is steady in some segments, but not so much in others, that there is a little bit mixed response in demand. There are stocks of raw cashew nuts available in the country. There may be distribution issues because there's definitely spikes in local prices in some markets. And I think that there is probably a little bit of a reduced processing capacity in India, probably due to the mismatch between raw cashew nut prices and kernels. So perhaps Indian buyers moved a little bit later. Perhaps they were disrupted by the fact that Benin banned exports, although much of that material was exported in the end. And that has had an impact. So that's going to impact Indian demand for raw cashew nuts. So let's think about, why would different markets buy more cashew nuts in 2024? They've definitely done that. Why would they do it? And what would make them buy more in 2025? Well, in Europe, definitely economic resilience, improving economic conditions after the high inflation of 2022 and 2023. That's bringing a return to underlying strong consumer trends, helped by lower prices, but also people may have bought a little bit more because they expected more disruptions to transport and longer transit times in the early part of the year. And if they did that, of course, they would have been right. In the American market, again, more cashews because of lower prices, also expectations of rising freight cost and disruption, the port strike, which was expected during the year and which is now ongoing, reduced inventories. So coming into the year 2022 not being a good year, into 2023, the logical thing to do would have been to reduce your inventories to rock bottom levels. Interest rates were higher too. And then you start to replenish your inventories, and that means you need to buy more. Looking in Asia, particularly China and India, underlying consumer trends made Chinese buyers buy more cashews. Low prices made them more attractive. And as a general comment, increasing affluence and population right across the region continually impacts the demand for cashew kernels. So what does that mean going forward? Well, in 2025, from a European point of view, the low prices, they're gone. It's not going back to 245, whatever happens. The underlying consumer demand trend has been reestablished. Africa's share has increased and will increase further. Maybe it'll finish at this 21% in 2024, but I would expect it to grow in 2025. Overall snack demand is strong. And I was just reading Snacks magazine, the magazine of the European Snack Association, whereas snack demand is 2 to 3% growth, current and forecast, but snack nuts are growing quicker. One article mentioned snack nuts expected to grow between 8 and 10%. That doesn't mean cashews necessarily, but across the range, pistachios and all the other tree nuts, we are seeing strong growth. In the US market, a lot of these factors that would have caused a big spike in imports in 2024 are gone. Low prices are gone. Inventories have been rebuilt. There is a port strike on now. It's a fact, not a fear. And freight rates generally are moderating somewhat from the very high levels of 2021, 2022, and even into last year. Similarly, in Asian countries, low prices are gone. And the question remains, are the consumer trends in markets like China, in markets like India, the world's biggest market, are the consumer trends strong enough to withstand higher prices? Now, they have been in the past, no question about it. Will they be? How long will it take to adjust? We get a good clue for that when we get the reports after Diwali. So that's into November. We're going to get a pretty good idea of how the Indian market has managed higher kernels prices. So looking at this then, answering the question, can the strong demand trend continue? The yes argument on one side is underlying consumer trends are strong. Cashew prices are higher, but we've seen these levels before. We saw them 2 years ago. We saw them for many years. China has finally discovered cashews, and by the looks of it, may have fallen in love with them. And economies, generally speaking, in the consuming markets are strengthening throughout 2024 and expected in 2025. That's the yes side. The no side of the argument would be, no, this was all about low prices. Low prices boosted demand, that's gone. Secondly, buyers are discouraged. They're discouraged by defaults of contract. They're discouraged by inordinate delays in shipments and long transit times. They might even be thinking of just looking at something that's easier to deal with. Buyers may well hesitate in buying forward. They want to see if the price falls later in the year. They became accustomed to low prices. What should they do now? Should they wait, see the new crop in the Northern Hemisphere, or pull the trigger now on forward prices? Difficult decision. Certainly, it looks as if inventories at kernels destinations, and I think in all destinations, will be high by the end of the year, certainly higher than on the way in. That's only kernels, that's not RCN. And the other part of the no argument is, well, China didn't really discover cashews. What China discovered was cheap cashews. And if they're not cheap, they won't buy them, or at least not in the volumes that we've seen in the last 2 years. And that's a valid point, and it's an interesting point. Well, what do I think? Well, I think that number one, demand trends don't switch off quickly. I don't think they react to prices as quickly as we might expect. Secondly, I think that 320's prices, $3 up to $3.50 are workable. They're workable at every level of the system. Yes, I think buyers will delay making decisions to see harvest trends. Good crops in East Africa will encourage them to wait. But I think also that the price mismatch between RCN and kernels could disrupt demand. If you look at current RCN prices as an outsider, if you look at the RCN prices from the point of view of a buyer in a roasting firm or in a supermarket, and you look at that and you're going, this doesn't work. What should we do? Are higher prices here to stay? What's the risk? We have to see what extent Indian processors restock after Diwali, and that will affect demand in Tanzania. Later, it'll affect demand in Mozambique for raw cashew nuts. My thinking is that demand growth will slow down, that these 2024 levels cannot be maintained. They're spectacular, but they cannot be maintained. And we will return to the longer term growth trends. So that means relatively slow growth in the United States, steady, moderate growth in Europe, steady, moderate growth in India, still strong growth in China, just not at the kind of levels we've seen this year. And elsewhere, East Asia, continued strong growth, might be good standout markets. Australia might grow quickly, Japan might grow steadily, similarly South Korea. Middle East, well, I think Middle East market will return to 4-5% growth. So remain optimistic, but that recognize that 2024 was probably something of a bonus, an aberration, and it's interesting that it happened in a year where we had relatively poor crop by recent standards. One thing I did want to mention, and this also comes from Snacks Magazine, which is a good magazine for background on the nuts business, and that's about sustainability. There's an article in there based on a survey which says 64% of global consumers say they are worried about climate change. So we're now getting into sustainability arguments in cashews, but 41% complain that price is the main barrier to sustainable purchases. And this really puts us in a very interesting position, because we have cashew kernels are definitely one of the most sustainable tree nuts, but cashew kernels are relatively high price. How that is balanced and whether consumers are prepared to pay for sustainability is a big question for the next 3 to 5 years. Question 3. Are there enough cashews to meet demand in 2024? So this is supposed to be a provocative question. And let's have a look. First of all, we look at Vietnam. So let's just have a look and see if we can work out the balance sheet. So the first two parts of it you've seen from me before, what I think the opening stock was, what I think the crop was. Imports we know, so these are imports to mid-September. Here's that, this is the number of the day, this is the number of the year that the imports of Burma kernels reported from Vietnam are so high. I've heard from 2 different sources around about 90,000 tons. I do not know how accurate that number is, but anywhere near that number is remarkable. I calculate that, let's call it 420,000 tons of RCN. Take out exports, some domestic consumption, and you would end up with the balance around about 700,000 tons. That's about 2.5 months processing. That carries on what's there now, that carries through to the end of November for processors. So you might say, why is there a shortage of RCN talked about? Well, maybe we're seeing much more Burma kernels in the market. So RCN is less, but Burma kernels are more. The balance calculated is up by 0.7 of a month. So 2.5 now, was 1.8 back in August. Should be mentioned that the calculated inventories are lowish for the time of year, but don't forget that the Ivorian raw cashew nut was shipped late this year due to the export ban, and a lot of it is still on the way. Burma kernels balance the scales right now. So looking at this, it seems to me that from the mid-September, Vietnam needs about 2 to 2.5 months additional supply. To me, it looks like the balances in West Africa, and later maybe something from Tanzania. This year, Vietnam took 95,000 tons, I believe, from Tanzania. We'll see in a moment. Previous years it was a little bit lower, and occasionally it's been higher than that. So they do buy something in Tanzania, though the crop predominantly goes to India. And just to bear in mind that the Tet holiday this year it's not early, because it has been earlier, but it is a little bit earlier than it was last year. It's right at the end of January. rather than, I think last year it was the 10th of February. And if we look at this balance and we see how this came about, I just looked at 5 major suppliers of raw cashew nuts to Vietnam, and I compared performance imports from each up to the end of August in each of the last 3 years. And what stands out is Cambodia is well up, Cote d'Ivoire is well down. And if you look at it, Cambodia is up 192,000 tons and Cote d'Ivoire is down by 172,000 tons. So it balances out. It does mean that there are more high-cost raw cashew nuts imported to Vietnam, larger raw cashew nuts imported to Vietnam, better quality, generally speaking. And that means that there are more larger nuts available. It may mean also that there's more breakage available. But what really changes the balance is this, again, to mention the Burma kernels. So based on the figures that we received in the last few days on Burma kernels, African processors shipped more Burma kernels to Vietnam than they did kernels to all other markets put together. And that's quite a sobering thought for the development of processing in African countries. Let me say it again, there were more Burma kernels shipped to Vietnam in 2024 than were shipped as kernels to all other markets in the world from West Africa. Reconciling that with arguments on sustainability that were made at the African Cashew Conference is really quite difficult. Let's look at the Indian situation. Again, pretty high opening stock, smaller crop than expected. Estimates, so I only have official figures up to July, but we're estimating an additional 100,000 tons since, about 1 million tons used so far. So that includes some of the Diwali demand, but not all of it. That would give a balance of about 800,000 tons, about 5.7 months processing stock. To me, on the numbers, no real sign of any shortage there. So the Indian situation is still in play. It's fluid, if you like. I think Indian imports will probably fall below last year's figure, not by much, but they will be below the 1.2 million tons that was imported last year. I think that there will be a response to higher prices. Perhaps demand may grow, but it'll grow at much slower levels than would be hoped for. India needs, to my mind, about somewhere between 300 and 350,000 tons additional between now and the end of the year. And just to put it simply, that processing cashews in India is, due to the high cost of RCN compared to the kernels market, it's just not as attractive an activity as it was in the past, and that is likely to lead to lower capacity. So in both cases, relatively solid situation. Now, 5.7 months means less in India because the availability of new crop in India will be later than the availability of new crop in Vietnam or Cambodia. The Indian factories will not close in the way that Vietnamese factories will close in late January, early February for Tet. So both situations are balanced, but I'm not saying surplus by any means. So if we look at the question again, it is going to be a tight enough balance, but there's not going to be a shortage. If the raw cashew nuts that are around, the supplies, remaining supplies in West Africa, and the crop in Tanzania, if they're shipped. Only, and we're again end of August, only 394,000 tons has been imported by Vietnam from Cote d'Ivoire. That's due to the export ban. So estimated availability is about 700,000 tons. So it would seem that there's plenty still to come, either on the water, in bond, or on its way from warehouses in Cote d'Ivoire. Asking high prices right now as well. Slow late shipments are having an impact, but they're now coming to the market. So Guinea-Bissau, slow to ship, long transit, those are now coming to the market. I mentioned Cote d'Ivoire. So a lot of those factors, slow starting markets, are now coming to the market so that the supply is carried over a greater period. Effectively, what's happened is that we had lower quality raw cashew nuts in West Africa due to the growing conditions. We had a lower crop, maybe 10% lower, but the delays in shipment meant that this crop was mainly financed locally and comes to the processing market a little bit later. Good crop coming in East Africa, more on that in a minute. And really what we're seeing is that the lower crop in West Africa was balanced by a really excellent crop in Cambodia. So Cambodia had 800,000 tons plus, I think it could be 850. And that balanced a lot of the losses in West Africa. So in essence, I think what we've seen is a much lower quality crop, and that too has an impact, rather than a much smaller crop. And we started with good stocks. We started with plentiful stocks in India, and certainly the closing stocks this year of raw cashew nuts will be lower than the opening stocks. So the difference, the lower crop in West Africa and India, has been compensated for by a bigger crop in Cambodia, reduction in stocks, and a slower rollout of availability. It doesn't look, as we sit in the early days of October, as we're going to get into an acute shortage, but we will open 2025 in a much more balanced situation than in any of the previous 2 years, where inventory is less, prices are more realistic, and the market is set for growth. Perhaps not the rates of growth we've seen in 2024, but nonetheless, growth in demand. So coming to our final question, and we're going to come to James Mulhall, the Managing Director of Coastal Nuts, shortly. I'll just give you a quick introduction on the situation in Tanzania. So Tanzania, major supplier of cashew nuts, harvest September through to December. Looking at where do cashews grow. So most of the industry has been, over the years, centered in this part of the country, in the southeast, where factories, warehouses, cooperatives, and most of the trees were. This has expanded and is expanding, and much of the country is suitable for planting of cashew trees. So we are seeing an increase in the number of trees planted. The crop has been growing. The crop has been growing at about 5% per annum over the last 10 years. There have been dips. Production can be volatile. Inputs particularly have an impact on outturns at farm level in Tanzania, and we've seen some negative impacts of that. There have been a lot of changes to the system. We have seen different methods for processors buying from local cooperatives, although that's getting more complex now than it was in the past. And we will see the auction expected to kick off. I think it's the 11th of October, certainly mid-October, we're going to see the first auctions, and it will be intriguing to see what happens. And, you know, as usual at this time of year, we see a lot of people talking the prices up. That's a little bit self-serving and probably doesn't actually meet with the reality. Crop forecast for this year. So you can get conservative crop forecasts. Some people talking around 350,000 tons, probably more widely. People are talking big crops. The highest estimate is remarkably over 500,000 tons, but definitely all indicators are of a very good crop. James can tell us a bit more about that, I hope. So it looks to me as if Tanzania is about to enter a fast growth stage, new trees, better inputs distribution, government support, and new processors. Coastal Nuts is one of the early ones of those. It does look positive. And lots of news from Tanzania. So we're seeing stories, for example, the auction will go online this year on the Tanzanian exchange. This will be interesting to see what impact that has on the market. We see that there are plans to build an industrial park in Mtwara, a cashew industrial park, to encourage processing. We saw recently that a large container vessel called it Mtwara. That is a game changer. If you can export the raw cashew nuts directly onto ocean-going container vessels, that definitely changed the cost, and it changes the availability of product. And of course, we're seeing the changes in the method of operation of the system. So the payment system is changing. Not sure how that's going to work, but the payment system is changing. A lot of positive news coming from Tanzania in recent months. But let's go to someone who's there on the ground, so to speak, in Mtwara, James Mulhall of Coastal Nuts. Good afternoon, James. All good. And you?
Good afternoon to you too. Yeah, all good, thank you.
Glad to hear. James, I'm going to talk to you about cashews. Would you like to introduce Coastal Nuts a little before I do that? Anything to add to what I've been saying?
No, we're a relatively small company. We're on our second full year of production now, and we're trying to grow our business. And it's an interesting journey so far, I suppose.
Well, I'd say a couple of things about Coastal Nuts. Coastal Nuts is one of those companies that was a slow burner. They took their time, they did their homework, they took a long period to do this job properly. Within the first 2 years, they have got their BRC certification. The factory has been up and running. It's never easy starting a cashew factory, but they've done it. I have seen a lot of cashew nuts in my time, and I'll tell you, these cashew nuts these guys are producing are some of the best I've ever seen. But James, let's talk about the situation and the crop. We've heard from the board, we've heard from a few stakeholders, optimism on the crop. What's your own feeling? Are you seeing these forecasts of a very good crop?
Yes, I suppose I'll give it all with the caveat that the positive weather conditions are sustained during the harvest. But to date, the weather has helped greatly in producing a large quantity or an expected large quantity of harvest. It's impossible to know exactly, but talking to the people I know, it's anything from 50 to 100% higher than last year.
Wow.
So, yeah, they're quite bullish about it, and I've spoken to several people about it. So anything from 50 upwards, yeah. So
So
I'm
put that in
expecting a
perspective.
large crop.
Last year, the cashew board tells us the crop was 310,000 tons. So 50% up is 465,000 tons. That just blows away all records. What about the quality, James? We know Tanzania is known for high quality cashew nuts. Is it too early, or are you seeing any indications on quality?
Yeah, no, we've done a good bit of quality checks in various different areas, and the quality is also good. Now, the quantity, as I said, we have to take it with an estimate, but I do know the quality is good in that we have sampled a lot of different areas for quality, and the quality is good. Yeah, yeah, we're happy with the quality so far.
That's great news. And do you think that's likely to be the long-term trend? How do you see production growing in the coming years? Are we on a positive trend?
Well, as you said a little bit earlier, a lot of trees have been grown, and talking to again some of the guys in the field, they would predict that it will steadily increase. Yeah, that there is enough trees being planted and grown, and that this time next year, if we had the same weather conditions, there would be an increase year on year. The amount or the percentage of year on year, I don't know, but there has enough trees have been planted, and there will be an increase in production here. Yeah, yeah.
That's interesting. It's been talked about for a long time. It's good to see it come into reality. There's also, of course, if the trees are planted throughout the country, there's also the prospect that you could get a crop, a northern hemisphere crop in one part of the country and a southern hemisphere crop in another part of the country. That would be good news, wouldn't it?
Yeah, anything to lengthen the season for a single origin supplier would be helpful. Yeah, even if you get a month a couple of weeks at either end of the season, a month, month and a half. Anything that would improve that is would be very helpful for single origin suppliers.
So we've seen a lot of changes in the last couple of years, allowing processors to deal with the AMCOs directly. Has that made a difference to you as a processor?
Yeah, last year, it's helpful. It's helpful to get a connection with the AMCOs. It's helpful to get a connection with the areas, so as understanding the quality and where you're buying it from. So that is helpful. It's helpful in from a cost perspective to a small degree. But as of yet, we don't know the changes that are being made to go through the unions, as in the AMCOs haven't opened yet. So I can't know how it will turn out, but it's something new, and anytime you change something from the what it's at, I think it'll take a little bit of time to bed in. So yeah, I think it'll take a little bit of work to figure it all out.
Yeah, just to put some
through
context
the
on that
unions.
for people who may not be aware, but the cashew board announced that the payments to farmers will be handled through cooperative unions this year, and that's to me that's a surprising change. The idea is that it would speed up payments from the auction, but I still strongly feel that processors should be allowed dealing in every way directly with AMCOs, because this will ensure a good supply chain organization and traceability. That's my opinion. Obviously, James is waiting to see how this develops. But in terms of quality, you've mentioned that the crop looks good. What about your own quality, your kernels? What kind of reaction have you had over the last 18 months or so to the quality of your kernels?
Yeah, we've had a good reaction. For us, the main goal is to try and find customers who want quality and are happy to engage with us for our quality rather than quantity. And we have managed to find a couple of customers who want quality, and they're quite keen to work with us again because of the quality more than anything else. So if you can find the quality markets, and if any other processors here in Tanzania, for different reasons, the main goal would be to find the quality market, because we're paying a lot higher price for raw cashew nuts here than in West Africa. But if you can find the quality market, you can keep it because the quality is here, regardless of how good or bad we are at processing the cashews. The raw cashew nuts that are produced here in Tanzania are just excellent. So we get rewarded for that, even if it's a higher price.
Yeah, and you know, I certainly have seen some of the reaction to samples of your product. I remember one particular, it was a large roaster, saying, "What do we do with this? It's so much better than anything else we're seeing. We're going to have to make a specific product that fits for this quality." The quality was so good. We were talking about color and taste in particular. So interesting times.
Yeah, and the fact that we're able to get to market a lot quicker with our products. So by the time we process and to get to market, it makes that freshness a little bit better for the consumer as well.
And does this, I meant to ask you actually, does the access to AMCOs, does that allow you to put a traceability chain in place?
Oh, it definitely helps with that. Yeah, yeah. Because you're able you can bring, yeah, very much so. Yeah. You're buying it from the auctions, it's quite difficult to do that. Whereas you know where you're buying it from. We know the AMCOs and we know the group of farmers, so very helpful.
Okay, this is all working in the right direction in Tanzania. I think we might be seeing a real upturn in the Tanzanian cashew industry, and coastal nuts is part of that. James, you and me, we first talked about cashews in, believe it or not, 2012. It's been a long journey. You've made that journey. I know it's had its ups and downs. So a lot of people are looking at investing, big companies, small companies. What advice would you give to an investor or to a new cashew processor?
Here in Tanzania, and I'll compare it to Uganda, where I've done spent many years working there as well, rather than, let's say, between here and Europe. Between here and Uganda, there's a lot more paperwork. It's a lot more bureaucratic than my experience in Uganda, and so you have to be aware of that, and you have to be patient about that, because that is what it is to do business here. It's very bureaucratic. But that's a patience thing, and you have to plan accordingly for that, and take the time, because licenses, etc., will take a number of stages. So, but that's planning and patience. The more difficult side of things is access to finance here for trade finance. So that's the one thing I'd say. We had the Minister for Agriculture touring through the factory this week, as your video showed earlier. And when he asked the question of what's the barrier of getting to capacity, because we have a capacity of 12,500 tons, and to get to there is trade finance. We have quality cashews. We have a market. Yes, the RCN price is higher here than in West Africa. We can somehow make up the difference, given that it's higher quality and easier to process. If we get the 20 cents premium that you spoke about, that makes it definitely more feasible to work with. But all that being said, if you don't have the trade finance to buy the raw cashew nuts, you can't get up to capacity. And we have to buy all of our cashews for processing from January through to August. We have to buy them during the season of October to December. So yeah, that's the more difficult end of things that our side would be access to trade finance here locally with local banks. That's a challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, so the logistics is also time consuming more than anything else. So again, this will be harder on your working capital by the time you get the process to market, or your kernels through to market. Is just a little bit cumbersome as well. So that's my advice. If you're in a well-established business, cashew business, and has access to trade finance, then that stumbling block will be a lot easier. But as a relatively startup as we are, it's more difficult.
James, thanks very much indeed. So that was James Mulhall, and thanks, James, for your openness and your willingness to come on and talk about your business.
Very welcome.
James is the managing director of Coastal Nuts in Tanzania. Coastal Nuts is a supplier of high quality cashew kernels. It is BRC certified, offers traceable cashew nuts. If you're a buyer, give them a call. If you're looking for an interesting example of how cashew processing can develop, take a look at Coastal Nuts. I wish you continued success, James.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jim.
Okay, so that's kind of what we wanted to say on markets today. I'm going to hand you back to Ernest, and let's see if there are any questions in the pipeline. Ernest.
Hey, Jim, thanks so much for an interesting presentation there, and thanks to our host here, who has also shed a lot of light. Our guest, was also shed a lot of light on the East African situation. James Mulhall, it's always a pleasure to see you, and thank you so much for being on this edition. But then there's a question indeed, there are two questions for James, and I would like to start with the first one. This first one has also been written twice, so it tells you that there's a lot of interest on that. That indeed, what are the cost of raw materials in Tanzania, and how does that play into your cost of processing? So, James, the listeners want to know.
Okay, the cost of raw materials is this year is unknown yet until the auction price see how the auction price goes from the first auction. So yeah, it depends on that price. That makes it a bit of a challenge for us here in that our competition would be the Indian processors who are looking for good quality cashews for their processing factories. So that's what I said when I was trying to explain that you need to find the quality markets for your product, because we're paying anything from $300, $400 more here than in West Africa. So I can't give you a precise cost. Only last year we were paying, I think it was around $350 was the difference between West Africa and East Africa. Now we are buying better quality, which means that we will get a better yield, and it's a little bit easier to process. So there are the benefits. But even with that, we're still competing with a different price point for the Indian market if we're selling to a European market. So it's really important to find a quality market to be able to get the price. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, well, thank you, James. The second one is the person wants to have a frank answer. Were AMCOs useful in the access to raw nuts by processing companies? Your own perspective.
Oh yes, definitely. Access to the AMCOs is beneficial, and it's important for processors. Why would processors need to pay or need to be involved in the costs of unions and the process of unions if the cashews are going to be processed locally? The system in place for unions and AMCOs for selling to the world and selling to traders is absolutely fine. There's no issue with the system they have in place, but there's no reason for local processors to incur those costs. So by having the access to the AMCOs is excellent. Yeah, it's really beneficial. From a cost point of view, helpful, even though we still have to pay a good few fees, but also from understanding where you can get quality and working with the AMCOs and indirectly with the farmers as well. So yeah, it is helpful.
Yeah, thanks, James. We have another question here, and I think Jim, you have to also get in with this one. How much quantity is being processed annually in Tanzania? And the person wants to know for 2022 and 2023, and then any expectations for 2024.
You're throwing that at me. Thanks very much.
Yeah,
That's actually quite a difficult question to answer. What we know is that processing has been increasing. Processing in Tanzania went through a very poor period where a number of factories were closed, and it's making a comeback. I think you're looking at something like 15,000 tons. Now, I have seen figures, and there's a crazy figure out there of 60,000 tons, but that is based on a balancing of the crop against the exports, and it just doesn't work. That isn't happening. But there are new factories. There's Coastal Nuts, of course. There are factories in Mtwara, Tandahimba. There are factories in Zanzibar, Dar es Salaam. These factories are, many of them, quite small. So I'm being optimistic at 15,000 tons. I think that figure will double very quickly. I also think that there will be new factories opened. We won't see the results of this really until maybe 2027, 2028. It is a it's a long project to set up a cashew factory that makes sense, a modern cashew factory, a mechanized, semi-mechanized factory. It is a competitive market. West Africa is competing for investment in cashews. But I think that the growth in the quality cashew kernel segment will encourage further investment in Tanzania. And I think that if you look at Tanzania as a destination for cashew investment, you also have to consider that you're focused on high quality markets, high quality cashews for high quality markets, high yielding cashews. I just see a question there related to the production. A 50% increase in the RCN crop, is that realistic? Well, by all accounts it is. And it does come as a surprise, a good surprise, but nonetheless a surprise. But many, many people are reporting this. We have a number of factors. We've better supply of inputs. We've increased number of trees, and we've good weather conditions that could well see the crop grow at that kind of a level. So is it realistic? It certainly looks like it.
Yeah, and indeed, Alfred Francis, the Director General of the CBT, will be appearing on the next GME on 23rd of this month. And I'm sure he will give all the information and also more precise estimations there. But James, there's a question here. Why you choose East Africa as an investor to set up a processing factory when the volumes are high in West Africa? I ought to know the advantages.
The main reason,
yeah,
I suppose the main reason is location. I was living in Uganda for a decade, so I know how to do business in East Africa a little bit more than I do in West Africa. So that would definitely be one factor. The second factor is if you have quality, you can develop good supply chains, and you can try and figure out and get to the people or the businesses that want quality. And if you can develop those relationships and make them strong, and you can consistently supply quality, they're good, strong relationships. It's quite difficult and it's long term, and it's difficult to compete with the buyers coming from India, because they're kernels that are a higher price when they're selling them, etc. All of these things are difficult factors. However, if you can develop the long-term relations with quality, it's more sustainable. So that's my reasons.
And now, Jim, one question here on the quality of RCN in Tanzania. Historically, how has it been like?
Historically, the quality in Tanzania has been excellent. We're looking at 52, 53 pounds. Generally speaking, we are, the DG of the Cashew Board of Tanzania told us at the conference that I think it was 95% of all cashew nuts produced last year were higher than 48 pounds. So we're looking at a very good outturn, relatively large nuts, and much sought after. I will pick up, if I may, Ernest, on one comment in the chat. So there is there's quite a good comment there. 310,000 tons crop of 2023 looks a bit of an overestimation. Do you know, I was agreeing with that for a long time. And if you'd watched earlier webinars, we had plugged a figure in closer to 240 and later 255. And that's where it's at. The 310 is the estimate of the Cashew Board. It's their official figure at the moment. It's based on trade, and it's based on processing and local consumption. But it is something I would like to take up with Alfred Francis when we get to the 23rd of October, and he will join us then, and we can discuss that in detail. But it is a good point, and it is a question that is not yet fully answered for me.
And indeed, we will give him all these questions so that again he comes more with the basis for the estimations that are being made. And then I know we're talking about good crop among others there. So I think, Jim, I don't see any more questions that you should answer. And I will take the opportunity now to thank again James Muhall. And we know the conference is coming to Tanzania in November next year. So there's going to be more opportunities to also hear from you. And now I go back to Jim Fitzpatrick to tell us what to expect between now and 23rd of October when we have the next edition.
Well, I'll leave you with some questions, maybe some things to look out for in the market over the next couple of weeks. Firstly, it's going to be really interesting to see how the Tanzanian auction will kick off. We'll see online trading for the first time. How will that impact prices? We often get tactical buying early in the season. Sometimes we get high prices paid, which are actually in order to post levels to set up for sales. I don't think many people were expecting crop estimates as high as they're coming out. Tanzania is an important supplier of cashew nuts for India, mainly, but in the last couple of years, we have seen 95,000 tons into Vietnam and 75,000 tons into Vietnam in the last 2 years. So it is an important origin for Vietnam too. Second thing, I think what's really important, we talked about balances, we talked about are there enough cashews in the world. One of the factors that influences this is who holds the inventory. How strong are the holders of raw cashew nut inventory, particularly in India, but also in Vietnam, and how will that impact prices over the coming months? Third factor, I mentioned it during the main discussion, Indian demand, biggest market in the world. How will festival demand, Diwali demand in India have responded to higher prices? Now, we've seen reports of some very high prices in India. What's that going to do to demand? What it does to demand will determine, to a large extent, how Indian processors restock or buy from the auction in Tanzania and how they behave for the rest of the year, which in turn has a knock-on effect in Vietnam and tends to set the tone for the start of the new Northern Hemisphere season from January onwards. Question over Chinese demand. So to put it more succinctly in a way, are cashew consumers in China here to stay? Has cashew really made it in the Chinese market, or is it a short-term trend based on lower prices? It's quite possible that China will grow to be an enormous market in the next 5 years, but it's also quite possible that it will return to slower levels of growth. How will these higher prices impact that? If Chinese demand next year is like Chinese demand this year, then it is a bit of a game changer. So that's really interesting question to keep an eye on in the coming months. And the final thing, again, demand related question. What will forward buyers in Europe and the United States do? Will they wait, minimizing their purchases to see how the new crop in the Northern Hemisphere comes in? Or will they start making some moves now in expectation of higher prices? Hard question to answer. A lot of other factors play into that question. Economic conditions, demand, inventories, currency, interest rates. We will get some idea of that, and hopefully we'll have some more news on all of these questions when we're back with you again online with the GME with Jim on the 23rd of October. Ernest, it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much indeed.
The pleasure is ours. Always a pleasure having you. And I see also that you have touched on two last questions that came up, that of Rohit on the importance of Tanzania to Vietnam. But then Amadou Bade is asking also for the processing balance. So at some point, we may also have to look at what kind of processing volumes are coming up this year from Africa and elsewhere, and then to be able to also know how we are developing on that front, apart from raw cashew nuts. So on that note, thank you so much, Jim. And
my pleasure. Thanks to James.
Always a pleasure having you and the participants and everyone listening to us. Thank you to interpreters and to the team behind. And bye-bye to everyone.
Thanks, Ernest.
Yeah, October. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care too. Bye.
you.